Welcome back to a very special episode of Good Law, Bad Law. His last words were, "I can't breathe." On July 17th, 2014, Eric Garner died after a New York City police officer placed a chokehold on him. What has happened since has been a 5-year journey into questions about treatment of Blacks and Latino at the hands of police, including in cases like Eric Garner's case, nonviolent, low-level crimes in our cities and across our country. My guests today are 3 individuals deeply committed to this issue and very much involved in this issue. Monifa Bandele, who is a community organizer in New York City. She's also on the steering committee for the Communities United for Police Reform and an activist with Black Lives Matter, as well as Alvin Bragg and Gideon Oliver, 2 attorneys who are representing the Garner family in a new lawsuit following on the heels of the New York City Police Commissioner firing the officer who placed that chokehold that led to Eric Garner's death, Daniel Pantaleo. They are the lawyers leading the family and 5 community citizens in a quest for total transparency and accountability in this case, release of all the investigative documents, all the materials that will show what happened and what didn't happen and what should have happened in this very important case. This is a very, very important conversation that we're offering in this episode. I know you are going to find this as fascinating and important as I did, and I welcome your comments and your feedback. Please take a listen and then let us know what you think. Stay tuned. Welcome everyone to today's episode of Good Law, Bad Law. Today we're going to be discussing an extremely important issue and one of the leading cases that throws light on this issue, and that is the issue of police excess force, use of excess force by police and the impact particularly on African American and Latinos in our country. Joining me to talk about the case of Eric Garner in New York are my guests today, 3 individuals. Alvin Bragg, a visiting professor of law at New York Law School and the co-director of the Racial Justice Project, and one of the attorneys representing Eric Garner's family. Also with me is Gideon Oliver. He is the founder of Gideon Law in New York and is also one of the attorneys representing the Garner family. And also joining us is Monifa Bandele. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She's the senior vice president for momsrising.org, and she sits on the steering committee for Communities United for Police Reform and is a member of Black Lives Matter, and is also, and she's going to tell us about this today, one of the citizens in New York who has filed a lawsuit quite recently that seeks to have released from the New York Police Department and the City of New York all of the materials relating to the Eric Garner investigation. First of all, I want to welcome all of you to the podcast. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having me.
I thought we're going to get into today a number of aspects of this enormously important issue, the facts of the Eric Garner case, for those who may not be yet familiar with what happened on July 17th, 2014, and since over these last 5 years. And then I want to broaden out the scope and talk about the issue more broadly, and also have us discuss what are the systemic issues that need to be addressed and what specifically you all think must be done to address these systemic problems in our law enforcement and criminal justice system. So I thought, Monifa, we could start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Monifa. Of course, I give a very brief summary of your background, but tell us a little bit about yourself. And then if you would, again, for those listeners who may not be familiar with the underlying facts of Mr. Garner's case, give us the summary of what happened, and that'll then give us a good launching point for our conversation today.
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for having me. I'm glad to be having this conversation. A little bit about me at Moms Rising. We work on issues that impact women and mothers from the workplace to their communities to politics. I specifically have been focused on the crisis in the United States around Black maternal health. Mm-hmm. And in my work with Communities United for Police Reform, it comes out of many decades that I've been volunteering in New York City doing anti-police brutality work, really going back to 2000 with the organizing that happened around Amadou Diallo. And so many of the recommendations that we talk about today, many of the problems and the issues that we discussed today with Eric Garner's case really go back to then and even before then in the 90s with a case that many people know about too, Anthony Baez, another chokehold death in New York City. Okay. But how did we get here? So it was 5 years ago in July that Eric Garner broke up a fight in Staten Island and was confronted by police not too far from where he lives. There was a discussion between them, and he ended up on the ground in a chokehold. Officer Pantaleo basically strangled Eric Garner there in front of about a dozen other officers, including some supervising officers. And this was all captured on videotape. And as that video emerged, that's where we got that saying that really went viral around the world, "I can't breathe." He said, "I can't breathe" 11 times before he could no longer breathe. Someone from that day has been arrested. It was not anyone responsible for Eric Garner's death. It's actually the young man who took that video, Ramsey Orta, is still in prison because of the retaliation of the police. But it's been a long half-decade fight for the Garner family to try to get the officers prosecuted and then subsequently to try to get them fired from the force. And so here we are.
And I think it's important, Monifa, for people also to understand that these kinds of situations, and obviously what happened to Eric is not unique in our country today. These kinds of situations are often happening in very low-level crime type situations, and the ostensible reason why the police and Daniel Pantaleo were there confronting Eric Garner was because they say he was illegally selling individual cigarettes in the neighborhood in Staten Island. Right. So I think
these
people...
we call them these broken window policies, and we see them used to both surveil and profile our communities, Black and brown communities in New York City. But we also see them used as a way to cover up, which is what we saw in the Eric Garner case. Actually, during the disciplinary hearing of Pantaleo, it came out that it was a lie, that they lied on the police report that Eric Garner was selling cigarettes. But when they say the lie goes around the world 2 times before the truth can catch up. And so it's so easy to say, oh, this person was selling loose cigarettes, or they had an open container. I mean, we hear it over and over again, these kind of like low-level violations and broken windows violations and low-level crimes that people are doing and or accused of doing to validate, this hyper-policing and this abuse that's happening.
And I think we should be really blunt about this in setting the context here. I mean, you referenced back to a couple of high-profile police brutality cases in New York City from the 90s, but this has been going on in Black and brown and minority communities for decades. I mean, this goes back to the days long before the civil rights movement, back to the days of Jim Crow, when loitering that the issue of loitering could be a basis from law
these
enforcement
black codes that we
right.
heard about in these discussions around 1619, this being the 400-year anniversary of Africans arriving to the United States. These broken windows laws sound very similar to black codes. Just put a little extra on it, and it still serves the same purpose. So
now,
policing in our communities help to continue to fuel mass incarceration in the way that those black codes re-enslaved newly emancipated Africans.
Now, this chokehold, which is in Mr. Garner's case was so fatal. Am I correct, Monifa, that even at the time, this was an unauthorized method, according to the New York Police Department's own rules and regulations?
This is an unauthorized method. It was an unauthorized method back in 1995 when it was used on Anthony Baez, and Officer Lavoti was fired and eventually served time for using a chokehold on another person. So it not only is it unauthorized, it's been against quote unquote NYPD policy for decades.
Right, and in Eric's case, it was particularly lethal, as I understand it, because in addition to the damage that can come from this type of police maneuver, the so-called chokehold, in his case, he actually had asthma, and that was part of the consequence of using this maneuver on him. And then there's a whole lot of issues around how quickly medical attention was sought for him, and how quickly and efficiently and diligently medical attention was provided to him. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I definitely want Alvin and Gideon to jump in here, but one of the things that we're seeking to find out are more details about what exactly happened. We see a supervising officer on the scene while Eric Garner is pleading for his life, and we see her doing nothing. We heard through the disciplinary trial of Pantaleo transcripts of text messages back and forth to police officers like, "Oh, I think he's DOA, no big deal." But this just scratches the surface. If we could get all of the data that we're seeking from this lawsuit, then we'd be able to see what every single factor was that led to Eric Garner's death, who played which role. Many people have asthma. My husband has asthma, but if you strangle him, that is the cause of his death,
for
and
sure.
Not asthma, right? So,
well, exactly, and I only mention that because some conversations that I've heard, some commentators I've heard have tried to say, well, it wasn't the chokehold; he had asthma,
exactly.
as if that is some kind of offsetting factor in this particular case.
Yeah, like, I shot him in the chest. Oh, well, he had heart disease. Yeah, exactly.
Right, exactly. And listen, don't feel bad, Monifa, too, because I know that you have a hard out and can't stay for the whole time that we're going to have together. So I don't feel badly that we're focusing so far on you and hearing from you. Because Alvin and Gideon will be able to stick around longer than you can, and I am gonna save some questions about the more law-related parts of this conversation, and they'll have ample opportunity to jump in on that stuff.
So those facts that we want to get, so it would be everything. It would be the medical. What did the medical personnel on the scene do and not do? Like that's the level of information that I'm hoping come from this judicial inquiry.
Well, let me ask you, Alvin, just because we're on it, and then I do want to get back to Monifa before she has to go. Because this is, when I read what this lawsuit actually was, it seemed it's fascinating, and I've never heard of this of this kind of a case being brought before. Tell us, maybe fill in a little bit of what has happened recently. I think many of us saw the press conference on live on television when the New York Police Commissioner O'Neill announced that Pantaleo, the one who did place the chokehold on Eric Garner, was being fired from the New York Police Department. That was that was just a couple of weeks ago, I think, right? So what is this lawsuit that is now being brought? Who is bringing the lawsuit, and what exactly is it that you are seeking through this lawsuit?
Sure. So the backdrop here, as you said, the commissioner announced that Officer Pantaleo was being removed, and then the mayor sort of used language sort of suggesting that we're going to turn the page and move on. But as Monifa was saying, there's so many unanswered questions, and so this action it's a sunlight provision. The New York City, similar to a lot of municipalities around the country, is governed by a city charter, essentially the Constitution for the city of New York, and it allows for, in the language of the city charter, 5 citizen taxpayers, so 5 people who are here in the city to bring an action compelling 5 these 5 folks here compelling a city employee or officers to be brought and testify under oath, if the judge grants it. So it's a judicial inquiry. Here, the petitioners are Gwen Carr, Eric Garner's mother, Alicia Flagg Garner, his sister, and then civic leaders like Monifa, who've been with the family since the beginning, pushing for transparency and accountability. And the suit is brought against Bill de Blasio, the mayor of the city of New York, James O'Neill, the commissioner of the NYPD, the fire commissioner, Daniel Negro, who he's brought because he has oversight of the 911 dispatch system, which is responsible for medical care. And then the deputy police commissioner, Kevin Richardson, who oversees discipline. And the legal theory is that where an officer, an employee, either violates a known duty or fails to act in the face of a duty, a judge, here a judge in the Supreme Court of New York, can compel testimony, have them come in and say why action was taken or why action wasn't. And the city charter imposes on the mayor and the police commissioner an obligation to have full, fair, open, transparent, and independent investigations into police conduct. And I think by any objective standard, that has not happened here. As Monifa was saying, there's so many open questions. Mr. Garner's alleged arrest record was leaked to the press. There's a case directly on point where a prior one of these suits, a judicial inquiry was granted where something exactly like that happened. Confidential medical records were leaked. I mean, these are violations of express duties of city employees. Who did that? Under what circumstances? Who ordered it? These are the type of questions that citizens deserve answers to, and the city charter gives us a vehicle through that. And so that's just sort of a flavor that we're looking for.
Well, and also Monifa mentioned the individual who took the video that went viral, and if that person indeed is being retaliated against, I assume that would also be part of what you want to try to get to the bottom of and get answers about.
It's sort of all encompassing, sort of what discipline was taken and not taken. What was the oversight? We want to really get to the top. I mean, we're asking for the testimony of the mayor and the police commissioner. And another fundamental thing, which Monifa mentioned and you mentioned, but I want to really underscore, is the truth telling. What really, in my view, sort of broke open the Rodney King federal case was they didn't know there was a video there either, and there was statements on police records about what happened during that encounter. And we have the same thing here. We have an Officer D'Amico, who before he knew there was a video, went back and filled out the arrest record and there's a pretty straightforward question, reportedly, was force used during the arrest? And he said no, and there's a video which clearly, puts the lie to that. Was that part of the NYPD's investigation? Was there discipline for that clear lie? And this just isn't us, noting this. An NYPD deputy commissioner observed it and expressed reservation about it in the opinion which led to the discipline of Officer Pantaleo. So, these aren't our facts, right? These are the objective facts, and we're asking, what did the NYPD do? What did the mayor do? It appears nothing was done, and now it's up to the taxpayers in this action to get action and answers, and to hopefully compel some action.
Mm-hmm.
Monifa,
the irony in all this.
Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I'm like itching to say this because
go ahead, please.
This incident took place really on the heels of New York City electing a mayor who ran on a campaign. He ran on a campaign basically promising that police accountability and police transparency was a hill he was willing to die on. He rolled out his family. He used it in all his talking points. If you look at most of the media that was released by that campaign during his run, it focused on this issue and this issue specifically. So the fact that 5 years later, we are having to do this Herculean effort just to get transparency, transparency that we actually used to get under previous administrations, is
against
just
this
so
mayor,
ironic.
right?
Yeah, it's so ironic. And, it's not just that he's not done any advances in transparency and accountability. So there's really been a rollback. So the frustration is high, but we're confident that we're going to win because Wayne Carr is not giving up. And so none of the activists that are working with her are going to give up either.
Well, that's exactly the point I wanted to come back to you on, Monifa. And let me ask you, Alvin mentioned transparency and accountability. It's fascinating that technology to a certain extent has allowed for greater accountability. I mean, you mentioned the Rodney King case and video that was taken at that time. The advent of smartphones so that we all now carry and that have cameras and video capabilities, police departments that have implemented body cam videos that have allowed for, to a certain extent, a greater degree of transparency, and that things that may have happened essentially under cover of darkness now have light shed on them, and kind of that has created also perhaps you could say a greater awareness of this issue. And yet much of what has happened in this case and in so many like it happens in secret, happens behind closed doors. The New York City coroner, as I understand it, ruled the Eric Garner case a homicide. And yet when the federal government, through the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's Office, investigated, they brought no charges. But we don't know why. We don't know what they looked at. We don't know the basis of that decision. We know that there was an internal trial of sorts conducted by the New York Police Department. We know, and I think this was mentioned a few moments ago, because it was leaked, not because it was made public, but because it was leaked, that the deputy commissioner, Rosemarie Maldonado, who oversaw that internal police department proceeding, found that Officer Pantaleo's use of the chokehold was improper and that it was a gross deviation of police department regulation. We know some things, but we don't really have transparency, and therefore can you have accountability if you don't have transparency when it comes to things like that? So that's if you could address that, Monifa.
Yeah, we can't. There can never be full accountability without transparency, which is why many of the policies that we're going to discuss in this conversation, like repealing 50A, which is New York State's police secrecy law, are so key in us moving forward any other, simple pieces of justice, right? You don't know what you don't know. And so this accountability is a way to obstruct justice again and again and again. The secrecy really, really puts us at a position of disempowerment and victimization as individuals and as a community. So these issues are just so key. I think that the judicial inquiry is important for this case, for Eric Garner's case, but it's also putting the city administration on notice that we're not going to give up when it comes to this question of transparency. We can't just move on, which I know is what they had hoped at the end of the press conference where Pantaleo was fired. We know that there was widespread cover-up. Yeah, that would be it. It's time, you just go ahead, and that's not what's happening today.
In fact, they declared that was it. I mean, the mayor basically said, we're done here.
We're done here, and we're saying we're not done here.
Well, Gideon, let me ask you about that because, and I watched that press conference, and the police commissioner almost seemed apologetic to the members of the police department for taking the action that was taken to fire Pantaleo, and there, as the Black Lives Matter movement has grown, others are expressing, I don't know what the right word is, sympathy or concern or solidarity even with law enforcement that feels to some extent under its own kind of assault by the allegations and some of the light that's been shed on this problem. Gideon, what do you say about that? How does what you're trying to do, going beyond the firing of the officer who was most directly involved, how does it serve the interests of true justice in our criminal justice system and in law enforcement?
Well, certainly I think the hope is that the more transparency there is, the more possible some accountability is. And, I think that the Blue Lives Matter crowd and the NYPD officer, after Eric Garner was killed and, there were the protests, there were NYPD officers who, counter-protested wearing shirts that said, "I can breathe." And, so there's serious problems with police culture, that and lack of a culture of lack of accountability, lack of outside accountability, a culture of closing ranks and defending officers no matter what, and also culture of talking out of both sides of their mouth. There's this tremendous gaslighting experience when people watch the video of Eric Garner being killed and see Officer Pantaleo use a chokehold, and then there's sort of like years of litigation, within the police department's administrative process about whether that was a chokehold or not. And so I think that there are a lot of police officers who aren't used to the idea of being accountable to the communities that they serve, and that every step that we can take towards transparency hopefully can lead toward accountability. I think part of the issue is it's not that accountability isn't going to come from Police Commissioner O'Neill, not going to come, I don't think, from within the police department. And in New York City, it's certainly not going to come from somebody like Mayor de Blasio, who, as Monifa pointed out, really ran on police accountability and reform, and has really been a traitor on those issues.
Well, I want to.
Eric, can I?
Yeah, go ahead, Alvin, please.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things. So I've worked as a prosecutor in both the federal and state systems, and have spent a lot of time on police accountability issues. And I see those two as inextricably intertwined. Like, to me, you can't have one without the other. If you believe in having a just system where we adjudicate crimes in a fair and honest way, then you must have police accountability. So the folks who try to separate them and somehow say that they are different and pit them against each other, I just find that to be such a false dichotomy. And just so the two things that to me, I don't think there can be any reasonable disagreement about, but yet somehow we do have this discussion, are transparency and truth-telling. So I don't understand a world in which the mayor or the police commissioner, and I certainly know I've got a lot more law enforcement experience than the mayor, can reasonably say that an officer who says on an official police form that no force was used in the arrest of Eric Garner is an officer who can be called to testify in court. If I were doing the cross-examination of that, or if you have to disclose, that's something you got to disclose to the defense. That's a lie that was told. That goes to his truth-telling, his capacity to dole out justice. It's integral to our system. And we didn't talk about the two sergeants, and one who said reportedly to investigators that during the arrest, Mr. Garner was not in distress. Well, I don't see how we can have reasonable disagreement about the veracity of that statement and what the import of the lack of veracity by that sergeant means for her ability to be a police officer, or at least whether it should be probed and discussed in an open way. Maybe the report was wrong. Maybe we don't have the facts right on that. But let's talk about it and explore it and not say that that's not a real issue that matters for that person being a police officer. So as someone who's done scores of cases, criminal cases, the system relies on the honesty of everyone who takes an oath, and officers take an oath all the time and testify. So the truth-telling function, I don't understand how one could reasonably say where there are legitimate issues of whether or not these officers told the truth of something that's depicted on video, that's not something that we should talk about and probe deeply and investigate. And the other is transparency.
Yeah.
I was when I was at the Attorney General's office in a role where we investigated use of lethal force, and when we did investigations, if there was no prosecution, we released reports at the end detailing all of our investigative findings and all of our legal analysis. And we would get pushback from law enforcement that the sky would fall. The sky never fell. The world did not end. What happened was that people actually knew what would happen. You had real transparency, and people were able to evaluate our decisions and know, and they could say, well, we disagree with this inference or we agree. And so the notion that actually telling the public what happened is antithetical to law enforcement, or somehow there will be secrets 5 years later, I've yet to hear it, and no one has even tried to unpack what that argument is. And I actually welcome the city's argument. I would love to see it unpacked in their response to our litigation, because I think it's I don't know what the right expression is, a red herring, or something like that, a paper tiger, something that a false argument.
Well, and I do want to come back to the legal issues in a moment, but let me come back to Monifa if I can, because again, I know your time is more limited. I like facts too, and I think there's a lot of misinformation in the public, in the media, in the way this issue is covered and talked about. I looked just this morning, and the Washington Post now has data that it publishes on its website. Anybody can go look at this, on the number of individuals shot and killed by police year by year, and it's broken down by race and gender and a number of other different variables. And this wouldn't count the Eric Garner case because he wasn't shot. But even when you look at these numbers, it's pretty staggering that in 2018, there were 992 individuals shot and killed by police. Of those 992, 229 were Black and 164 were Hispanic. In 2017, 986 in total were shot and killed by police. Of those, 223 were Black and 179 were Hispanic. And the numbers are pretty consistently disproportionate to the share in the total population represented by these, by Blacks and Latinos in our country. A recent study put out by the Academy of Sciences and a couple of academics looking at data on police violence and deaths by police officers now find, this is a very recent study, that 1 in 1,000 Black men will die at the hands of police in our country today, and this is a problem on so many different levels, but it's hard to ignore. It is impossible to ignore, as I think Alvin mentioned earlier. Facts are facts. So apart from the legal approaches, Monifa, what are you seeing and what are you finding in the community as more and more attention has come to this issue? What conversations are taking place between members of the community and our public officials in law enforcement and in government? Are any conversations taking place? What are those conversations, and what promise do you see for greater conversation, people sitting down and trying to figure out what actually can be done with everybody working and pointing in the same direction?
Yeah, so two things. One, facts are facts, but I think we're experiencing like widespread cognitive dissonance at like unprecedented levels, right? There was also recently, now maybe it's a year ago, a report also in the Washington Post about who's killing police. There's this thing of like the police are so afraid when they encounter Black and brown men. But when you actually looked at the faces of everyone that year that had like shot and killed police officers, it was overwhelmingly white men, right? So that's one piece, So the way that the Blue Lives Matter response is so visceral, specifically towards Black movement and Black people, is disconnected from the facts of when and where police, who and from whom police are in danger. So that piece is frustrating, and the conversation is frustrating, and people are realizing that, hey, this is like talking to a wall, right? People hear and see things and interpret them in ways that reinforce what they already believe or what they want to believe, right? As far as the conversations that are happening in the communities, you see a growing movement talking about what we call divest invest, which is that we must shift resources, attention, energy away from tools of criminalization, which include the police, which include jails, which include prisons, and funnel those things into things that create healthy and whole communities, like mental health services, decent education, employment opportunities, housing, While the backdrop to this whole conversation is that homelessness has exploded in New York City, right? And those things create unsafe communities. And if you walk down my block and you ask anyone on my block, what makes you feel safe? It is not the fact that the 79th precinct is on the corner. You will not get that response from a single person who's from here. New neighbors, yes, but not the Black and brown community that's been here for decades. What will make people feel safe is knowing that their neighbors who are in distress are able to get the services they need, that people have housing. So you see these conversations happening and growing. You see more and more papers and reports and studies put out that say, do we really need to be policed to the extent that we are? Is there a new model? Is there a better model for community safety? Was this even ever a model designed for community safety? And more people are saying no. And so that brings us, that fuels us, that brings us hope. We continue to fight for justice, but at the same time, we're saying, why 45,000 police officers? Why was one of the first things that de Blasio did in the budget in New York City was hire 1,000 more police officers to the largest police force in the country, right? So those are the conversations, and it's really shifting how people are thinking about policing and about community safety.
Well, and of course, the loss of any life is a terrible tragedy. But Eric Garner, and that is, I think, at least must be part of why this particular case has such broad significance. I mean, obviously to him and to his family for sure, and his friends and community, but this was not a violent crime. This was not a dangerous neighborhood. This was not one of those situations that people can perhaps imagine sympathetically thinking of that police. I mean, in Philadelphia a few weeks ago, we had a terrible a tragedy where police officers were wounded in a shootout, trying to do their job in serving, an arrest warrant. I mean, there are, of course, plenty of situations where police officers do have to go into very dangerous situations, and there's, at least we hope, doing so to serve the interests of keeping our community safe. But you cannot say that about the Eric Garner case. And what does that say about the broader issue that we're facing in New York City, but not only in New York City, in cities and communities all across the country? What does the Eric Garner case say about that problem?
About the problem that police are, I mean, I think it goes to what I said, is there's a disconnect. Police officers and the police unions are saying, we're in danger, we're at fear, but to what end and from whom, And so Eric Garner's death, Eric Garner's killing, really highlights the fact that they have racialized this irrational fear when it comes to Black people specifically, right? So the job is dangerous across the board, whether you have to police white militias in northern Michigan, or you're in communities that are facing really tough socioeconomic situations. This is I don't think anyone signs up and takes the job and joins the police force without knowing that this is a difficult and dangerous job, right? That being said, the hyper level of fear that they're saying they have, I'm not putting this on them, people say, we fear for our lives, but they specifically have coming into my neighborhood is not rational. When I look at the data of when, where, and how police officers are losing their lives, I agree with you. I feel like each and every life is valuable. Eric Garner's life is valuable. His life isn't expendable in a way to help protect that police officers' lives don't weigh more than his life, And so I think the conversation is really shifting around that, But there's a conversation around abolition, and if we did not have to feed a racist mass incarceration system, maybe many of these tens of thousands of individuals that have this very dangerous job can do something that is safer with their time and with the rest of their careers.
Well, I know you probably have to go soon, Monifa. I want to, as we do continue the conversation here, I want to thank you so much for your time and for participating in the conversation. Really appreciate it so much, Monifa Bandele. Thank you. And I want to thanks again. Thank you so much. And I want to now continue with Alvin and Gideon, because the cases that achieve notoriety, that achieve public attention, do offer opportunities to, of course, focus on the specifics of that particular case, but also to, draw lessons that go beyond that specific individual's case. And I want to get at some of that with you guys now, and ask, Alvin, as you mentioned, you have worked as both a prosecutor for the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York City and also for the New York Attorney General's office. And what are the, Monifa addressed this, I think, very powerfully from a community focus in terms of resources and needs in the community in terms of education, healthcare, mental health funds, and so on. From a legal standpoint, from the perspective of looking at the criminal justice system, what lessons do you see from this Eric Garner case and how it proceeded and how it didn't proceed that you think suggest structural changes that need to take place?
Right. So maybe going all the way back and really just focusing, because I think Monifa's addressed sort of the broader, issues, societal, focusing more narrowly on the legal issues, which, in some ways they're obviously very significant, but the broader issues about the mental health and where we are as a society are take precedent. But focusing narrowly for a moment on the legal issues, we started out with a grand jury presentation in Staten Island, in local under state law, where there was no where there was a grand jury but no indictment returned. I think there's some issues about New York law and the standard in New York law. Essentially, it should be the legal requirement should be that it should be absolutely necessary. That basically the use of lethal force should be sort of a last resort. As I say that out loud, it sounds like something that should be so intuitive and so clear that before you take a life, there should be, nothing else, left at your disposal to do. I think you could read the current law that way, but having sat in a jury room as the law is charged to a jury in a homicide case involving police force, it's open to interpretation and depends upon what words the judge emphasizes and what the jury hears. And so I think that absolutely putting in the words absolutely necessary or last resort or something like that would make it clearer and give guidance to juries, and that would be helpful. I also do think that it's just very sort of empty when a DA comes back and just says there was no charge here and there's no explanation given. So I would put a requirement in the law that they sort of report out, and we expect reports from all other, of our sort of functions. You think of all of our other government functions, these annual reports on things that I would argue are far less significant. So we've got grand jury secrecy laws in our state that could be updated, but even short of that, a lot of things that happen in these cases don't require, the use of the grand jury. A lot of this information, you don't have to use a grand jury subpoena. I mean, it's in the possession of the government already. The forensic reports, the gun, is already there, the bullets, the crime scene report. So I would put an obligation on both the federal and the state, because if you look at the federal report, which came out at the end very recently, it was a press conference, and they spoke about their ultimate decision, but gave very little. They basically said 5 years later, look at the video. It's like, well, we have the video, and didn't give any explanation about how they arrived at it. So I think on both levels, there's law reform, what the standard is, and then also transparency. If you're going to change the legal standard, and then also tell us how you arrived at it. And so on the federal level, there's a very high, the highest legal standard is willfulness. I mean, basically saying like, I almost woke up this morning and intended to kill you. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but willfulness is much higher than saying, I negligently caused I used this police maneuver that was, or I recklessly, I should have known that this would have caused the risk of your death, and I should have known that I shouldn't have done it.
Well, the civil law, and Gideon, I know that as a civil rights lawyer, you have you have represented individuals in police brutality or excessive force type cases. The civil law allows for a federal civil rights claim to be brought in this kind of a situation, and it doesn't require an intent to do harm. Am I right about that? Because we're talking so far about criminal law and why the U.S. attorney, why the federal prosecutors did not prosecute, but the civil law would allow some recourse, wouldn't it?
It would, right, because under the the federal Constitution, prohibits the use of objectively unreasonable force, and when you talk about objectively unreasonable force, you don't take into account factors like the state of mind of the person who's the officer who's applying the force. So, and in fact, there was a civil rights lawsuit that the family brought, and it was settled before there was discovery and transparency. And so, in addition to the petition that we filed, seeking the judicial inquiry, we've also filed a, sort of kitchen sink demand letter and freedom of information law request, with the police department and the Civilian Complaint Review Board that we hope will result in the disclosure of, more or less all of the records, every piece of paper that's subject to disclosure that relates to Eric Garner's killing and any related actual or potential investigations and prosecutions. And, the police department's response so far has been, we'll process the FOIL request as we process all of them. But the reality is that there are political decisions that are made by the police department and city agencies in responding to FOIL requests. And so, while we hope that the department and the CCRB will turn over as many of the records as they possibly can under the law, my experience in dealing with these kinds of cases is that rarely happens. And although facts are facts, we have a situation here in particular, but generally with respect to police misconduct, where the police commissioner and the mayor are putting out things that they represent are facts that are in fact misinformation. And obviously that's a really serious problem. The Department of Justice makes a decision, basically 5 years after Eric Garner is killed, and the city, in the meantime, and the police department kind of are telling everybody that the Department of Justice is, making them wait. And so the time to file certain departmental charges passes, without them being filed. And the reality is that the Department of Justice doesn't have the power to, prohibit those city agencies from acting, from taking investigative steps or, even moving forward with administrative prosecutions. So, we have a lot of misinformation, and that needs sunlight.
Well, so, we've been talking about transparency and accountability over the last hour, and I think most people would have to agree that, in principle, those are very important values and principles to adhere to and to insist on in a case like this. I know that, there has been some accountability, but obviously, as you've been helping us understand the issue more specifically, there's a lot for which there hasn't been accountability, and there's an awful lot about which there hasn't been true transparency, as you've said. I know the petition that's been filed that Alvin explained early on, brought by the Garner family and by 5 community tax-paying New York City citizens, is seeking the disclosure, Gideon, as you said, to shed sunlight on exactly what happened, how it happened, why it happened, and why things that many would say should have happened did not happen. What do you, beyond the truth and the facts, the real facts about what actually happened in all of those different ways with respect to Eric Garner, is there some way that you hope that by going through this process, not only for the Garner family, but that beyond the specifics of this case, that this process, that this exercise, that the judicial inquiry that you're asking for and the release of the documents that you are seeking will serve the broader interests of addressing this problem, which exists every day in cities across the country?
So I one hope is that the city leadership, in the face of this persistence, would see that next time they should just be transparent up front, so that if ultimately a court will order this, it's a lot easier to just do it the right way up front. So hopefully we will get that system change, and we're going to have leadership change in our city in 2021. The mayor's term.
Wait, Alvin, I lost you there for just a second. Go back to the beginning of what you were just saying. So we just cut out just for a brief moment.
Oh, sorry about that. I was just saying, hopefully the lesson for this mayor and then for a future mayor, because this mayor will be out of office in 2021, is that if a judge can and does compel these answers, far easier for the mayor and the police commissioner just to get it right in the first instance. So that we don't have to do this over and over and over again. So I think that's one very kind of straight line response that we can hope for. That if at the end of the day a judge is going to order it, and it's that's presumably going to be embarrassing to them, that just better for them to do it right. And the them, I say kind of in the broad sense, the them being any mayor and any police commissioner, realizing that the citizenship has this a right, will do the transparent and accountable thing in the first instance. That's the hope. And then specifically in terms of this action, hopefully, the disinfectant effect of sunlight will not just give us the answers, but will then prompt the city leadership to then act on it. So we'll learn what happened with who leaked the alleged arrest record, and hopefully something will happen to the person who took that unlawful step.
Well, let me end with you, Gideon. I mean, obviously, if somebody does wrong, and then we shed light on that is going to be embarrassing. But the point isn't to embarrass people here, right? I mean, the point is to bring about some kind of change through greater understanding of what happened in this particular case. So, Gideon, what is the good that you hope will come through this process?
Sure. I mean, listen, I think as a lawyer, right, every effort that I can make, win or lose in a case like this, is a tool for police accountability activists to push for, in some cases reform, but I think, as Monifa pointed out, ultimately, having serious conversations about and taking steps toward police and prison abolition, ultimately. So I think every small step, and this is, again, I'm not speaking on behalf of any organization. I'm a solo practitioner, and this is my, this is my take. But in terms of every effort, I think in a case like this, and Gwen Carr is a leader in a movement. I mean, unfortunately, she's been put in a position, and she and many others, not just in New York but across the country, are part of police reform and accountability and justice movements. And I think every effort in Eric Garner's case and every case like his, is going to provide ammunition for that movement.
Well, you mentioned police abolition a few moments ago, and that went by kind of quickly. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I think that's I think that is something that Monifa was ultimately hitting on or talking about. I mean, there's a tendency to talk about, kind of having these certain institutions like that, provide mental health and medical care and, investing in them in communities, but then not also talking about what happens with police. And I think that there are there's serious scholarship and conversations that has come out of serious activism around police and prison abolition. I'm thinking of Alex Vitale's book, The End of Policing. For example, we're sort of locked in talking about tinkering with training, and other reform efforts that these institutions and systems, to my view, are able to absorb, without really changing substantially. And so I think, when we're talking about abolition, we're trying to imagine and work toward, a world, where the institution of police and the institutions of prisons as they currently exist no longer exist, and the necessary functions that police now perform are performed in other ways.
Okay, so I think I understand what you're saying, but just to be clear, you're not actually, or are you actually advocating the elimination entirely of police in our society?
I think the institution of police as it currently exists should be abolished, yes, and that the role should be performed, and that the role should not be performed by what we know as police now. Yes.
Well,
your question?
Yeah, I have to admit I'm a little unfamiliar with that idea. I mean, who would be the people then that would protect people from drug gangs or from violent criminals, from white collar criminals who steal money and defraud innocent people? I mean, who would be the people who would do that if not law enforcement?
Yeah, well, there would still be law enforcement. It's not that there wouldn't be laws or law enforcement. It's that they wouldn't be enforced by a military-style gang that has no accountability to the community, which is what, in my view, most police departments are, and certainly the New York City Police Department is. So,
okay, I understand. If there was greater credit, yeah, go ahead.
In other words, the idea is that, that these institutions can withstand a lot of sort of tinkering and reform, and sort of, lumber on without, changing meaningfully. And so I think when people are talking about abolition, it's in part in recognition of that, if that makes sense.
So if there were reforms that could be made to have greater accountability, for instance, the petition that you all are filing now, if indeed that is successful and that brings about going forward in future situations greater upfront transparency and accountability, that would, I take it, make you feel that the police is less like a militaristic gang-like institution.
I would need to see it in order to answer that question, to tell you the truth. And I would need to know how that fits in, into the, how that fits into, other things that are going on, with policing as an institution, and how it interacts with other institutions.
Well, I think we may have hit on what may have to be another episode of this podcast to explore that more fully. But so that is fascinating, and I think that perhaps does warrant a more in-depth conversation to explore that more fully. But I want to at this point thank you both for being on the podcast to talk about the Eric Garner case and the efforts that you're helping to move through a legal system to try to bring about a greater transparency and accountability in the Eric Garner case and beyond on this issue more broadly. My guests, Gideon Oliver, a civil rights attorney in New York, Alvin Bragg, and a professor of law at the New York Law School in New York and a former state and federal prosecutor, and my guest, Monifa Bandele, of momsrising.org and also the Black Lives Matter movement. And I will put in the description for this episode links to all three of my guests so that people can check your bios and in Monifa's case, check out the Moms Rising website and see more about the work that she's doing. And we will watch closely as your case, as this petition that you filed for judicial inquiry in New York City on the Eric Garner case, as it moves through the system, we'll be following that closely to see what happens. Thank you all for being on Good Law, Bad Law. I really appreciate it.
Great.
Thank you so
Eric.
much.